Hey everybody, welcome to CAF Warbird Tube, the show where we talk about World War II, aviation, history, and so much more. Warbird Tube is produced by the Commemorative Air Force, the world's largest flying museum. Our mission is to educate, inspire, and honor through flight and living history experiences. The CAF began the Warbird movement more than 65 years ago, and thanks to the support of individuals like you, we continue to grow strong. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and now our host, Steve Buss. Thanks for watching and keep 'em flying.
Good evening, aviation enthusiasts, and welcome to CAF Warbird Tube. Tonight, on episode 164, Chris Netherclift, an esteemed member of the Commemorative Air Force's UK wing, is joining us, and we're going to talk about the Dam Buster raid. But this time, we talked about it about a month ago from an overall perspective. But tonight, we're going to dig a little deeper into the British perspective and how important it is to Britain's collective war memory. So we'll do that in just a moment. But first, I want to let you know that whether you're joining us for the first time or you're a loyal Warbird Tube fan, we're thrilled to have you with us this evening. If you enjoy the content and what you see, please share it on your social media platforms. We certainly do appreciate that. And if you do subscribe on YouTube, make sure you click that bell icon and you'll get notifications of our new episodes as they are posted. Now, Warbird Tube is made possible by the Commemorative Air Force. To find out more about the CAF, our events, aircraft, local units, or how you can be a part of the fun, visit our website, commemorativeairforce.org. Well, as we said, tonight we are going to take a look at the Dam Busters raid from the British perspective. And joining me now from across the pond, as they say, Chris, good to have you with us this evening.
Good evening. Good to be with you. Sorry. Good.
Before we get into the British perspective on the Dam Busters raid, you've had some pretty interesting experiences in the last few weeks involving the D-Day anniversary and some of the CAF aircraft that came across.
That's it. So there you can see Lee Block and That's All Brother. I'm a volunteer guide at RAF Greenham Common, or the former RAF Greenham Common, and so we have a strong affinity with That's All Brother, as she was based there during the Second World War with the 438th Troop Carrier Squad group. So it was fantastic to be able to get to North Weald, to see her, climb aboard her, have a look. And there you've got members of the US and UK wings, so the the Texas wing concerned, and obviously some of my fellow members. So it was great.
Yeah.
This is me. This at Greenham Common. So this is the last remaining bit of the runway that's there. But I was delighted to host with some of my fellow guides at Greenham, members of the Commemorative Air Force Ambrose tour recently, which was there. So I'm just explaining the layout of the runway, and That's All Brothers' role that was there to members of the tour. That's me with Lee in front of our control tower, which is our heritage centre. It's not a Second World War one. It's actually built between 51 and 54 for the Cold War. And Greenham Common played host to B-47 Strato jets from 54 to 64. Wow. It was a reserve airfield, and then from 1982, 83 to 1992, when it closed, it was home to 96 ground launch cruise missiles. And that was a very interesting era in locality, because there were many protesters who opposed the deployment of those missiles. And then finally, this is D-Day 80, the commemoration at Greenham Common. So we have 3 memorials. It's well attended, and you can see US Air Force personnel there, British Army personnel, cadets, and it was a very moving day. We had a great experience. So it was good to mark the occasion.
Excellent, excellent. Well, on to tonight's subject, and this is something that you have a long history of researching this particular raid, and a lot of the associated, as we said, has how this has become part of the British war memory, and a very important one, similar in the United States to the Doolittle raid, something like that. But again, from the American perspective, so many times we just think of the war as being, yes, there were allies, but the United States did everything. Well, that's not really the case. And so tonight, we're really hoping to kind of shed some light on what it looked like from your perspective as well.
Okay, yes. Well, what you're looking at is an image of a project I did for what was called my O-level history exams. So I did an exam, and I did 50% was this submission of this project. And we sat the O-levels. They've been replaced by something called GCSEs now, but the O-level was sat when you were 16. And you do it in a whole group of subjects, English, maths, etc. And then you specialise in the British education system onto the A-level, which you do for 2 years, and you do 3 subjects, and then that determines your university entry once you've gained those qualifications. So this is for my more general side of things. I researched Operation Chastise, so it's 1983, early-ish on. I probably submitted it around Easter, and I had the privilege of being able to exchange letters with Air Marshal Sir Mickey Martin, who was on the raid. I looked at the Paul Brickhill's Dam Busters, which we'll come on to, Gibson's book, and also some new publications that came out at the time around 1982 to get some further insight into the project. And one of the things, if we go to the next slide, one of the things that really struck me was the I put together, I photocopied an old copy of the Telegraph from the 18th of May 1943, reporting on the raid. And my father, who was born in 1927, so he was about the same age, give or take, that I was when I wrote this project, looked at it and said, I remember that newspaper being delivered, I remember looking at it, and I remember how pleased I felt. And that's one of those moments where you think, gosh, here is history coming back. And obviously, as Chris Kalakowski mentioned in the last broadcast, the British experience of World War II goes back to September the 3rd, 1939. So it's been 3 years of war, and it's not been easy. And I think about the hardships my father went through of being partly evacuated. He was in the sort of northeastern outer suburbs of London, being evacuated and eventually coming back after the Blitz that we went through, the Battle of Britain before that, the retreat from Dunkirk. So there are quite a lot of events that have happened before this raid occurs. If we go back to that early part of 1943, that first half of 1943, a number of things have happened. There's been the Casablanca conference between Churchill, Stalin and Roosevelt. So that's agreed certain things. So it agrees that the main theatre of operations, the main thrust will still be Germany first, Pacific second. But there's a price that the Americans and the Russians are expecting, and that's that they want more to happen on the front, on the main European front. So the RAF has to step up a bit. And RAF Bomber Command's had quite a difficult few years. They've moved to night bombing because clearly it was too difficult to bomb by day in terms of our aircraft didn't have the right defensive, they weren't built like flying fortresses were. They had to do that, but with older bombers like the Hampden and bombers like that. And it isn't until the arrival of 1942 of the Avro Lancaster and the Handley Page Halifax in particular, and then the Short Stirling is there too, which make up what we call the heavy bombers. And it's only the capacity of the Lancaster enables a mission like the Chastise mission to happen. So you need the ordnance, you need a heavy bomber to take the right amount of ordnance deep into the Ruhr Valley. So that's an important thing there. So Bomber Command are looking to improve, are being tasked with improving their performance. And one of the things that has come through, as we saw in last month's lecture, is this concept of knocking out the dams, which have been identified as targets from the late 1930s. And so, as we saw from the last episode, how Wallace was able to persuade the Bomber Command and Sir Arthur Harris in particular to allow the squadron to be formed with the upkeep weapon, we see that we saw how it was successful in breaching 2 of the dams that were targeted, the Mona and the Eder dams. The Sorpe dam was hit, but it was a different type of dam and was only damaged, only had minor damage. So this raid happens, and we see that. So how is the raid remembered? My dad remembers it at the time, and during the war, there's not a lot of information coming out. It's good for propaganda and morale for the British people. Details of the raid haven't really been explained to the general public for obvious reasons. We have the continuation of the war, and we see later on in 43, Operation Gomorrah in July 1943, where the Bomber Command, together with the 8th Air Force, firebomb Hamburg, and that's a tremendous raid with an awful lot of casualties. And at the close of the war, we have the raid in February 1945 on Dresden, again by Bomber Command and elements of the 8th Air Force. And there are a lot of casualties there, 25,000. And this raid, particularly in the British memory, is problematical because it's so close to the end of the war, and the casualties inflicted. Although there was a political decision to do this, the politicians start backing away from the decisions, and this leaves Bomber Command post-war not feeling too happy. A lot of the veterans are extremely unhappy. There is an award of an Aircrew Europe Star campaign medal, and there's a Bomber Command class for it. But for instance, the riggers and fitters at home don't qualify for that as they weren't aircrew. So there's no separate Bomber Command campaign medal, and this is something that's been irksome. In fact, it's very interesting to think about it, but the Bomber Command Memorial in London, in St James's Park, was only opened in 2012. So that's quite some time after the end of the war. There was a huge campaign to get it up and going, and to have it opened before too many of our veterans passed on. So this is also, this is in the background to this Chastise raid and how it is remembered. So if we look at the next slide, that should be, this is Guy Gibson's biography. I think obviously it was partly ghostwritten, but it's published posthumously in 1946, Gibson having been killed towards the end of 1944 in a mosquito incident. He was shot down in a mosquito. He writes about his experiences coming into the war. He's one of the most experienced pilots that we had. He was a bomber command. He commanded a bomber squadron. He commanded a night fighter squadron on bow fighters in all that experience. And he started the war as a pilot on Hampdens in 1939. And this book is quite interesting. It's had some work on it. It's been polished a bit. The 24-year-old Guy Gibson, who led the Dams raid, he was a bit of an abrasive character in some ways. Some of the NCO air crews thought he tended to favour officers. He could be quite short. There's a Victoria Taylor in a dissertation picks out something where Les Munro, one of the New Zealand pilots on the raid, loses communication and has to turn back, so he doesn't actually drop his weapon. And Gibson just said to him, "You were flying too high," and walked off. This is the kind of character he was, and he's getting a little bit of polish in this book here, and he's also getting a further polish in the next book, which is I'll show you next, which is Paul Brickhill's The Dam Busters. Now, The Dam Busters was written 1952, I think, around then. It's Paul Brickhill was an Australian who actually served in the RAF. He was a pilot. He was in the Stalag 2 when the Great Escape happened. So he writes that story first. He writes this one, The Dam Busters. He goes on, I think, in 1954 to write Reach for the Sky, which is about one of our Douglas Spada, one of our famous Battle of Britain pilots, who he flew with tin legs and also served in Colditz. So he's written some very, very popular things, books, and this book is good. It's a narrative story. It's partially fictionalized. Not all of the upkeep operation is declassified. In fact, some of it is, it's not fully declassified until 1962. And he also writes not just about the Dams raid, but also what the squadron did afterwards. So we have the fact that 617 sank the Tirpitz with tallboy bombs, again involving Barnes Wallis, who designed the 12,000-pound bomb that was used to successfully capsize the Tirpitz. So he also, if he didn't know anything, he had a habit, he admitted to making it up. And Alan, Alan Cooper's picked that up in one of his books too about that. So the historical accuracy of the book is a bit iffy in some cases, but the general narrative is quite good, and it becomes the basis of the film, which I think is our next slide. Should be, there we go. There's the poster for the film. It's very famous. It's shown a lot on television these days still. It gets a little bit of an edit here and there for certain language and words that are used in it, which are of its time but no longer appropriate. But it's a very good story. Again, Christopher Kolakowski referred to it. I might take a little bit of a difference of opinion with him. I think they smoothed Gibson out. He was older. Gibson is played by Richard Todd. Todd was older than Gibson, should I say. Todd served with the airborne forces on D-Day, so he was part of the Ox and Bucks who took the Pegasus Bridge on the British airborne side of things, which was, you know, the other end of the beaches from where the US airborne were. So he was a war hero, a little bit older than Gibson, but also, again, further smooths off the edges, if you like. So he's quite a likable character. The other way where I also might definitely differ is that Bomber Harris is very much nicer in the film than he was in real life. He was dramatically opposed to Operation Chastise. He did not want to lose a squadron of Lancasters to be converted for the upkeep weapon. He fought tooth and nail. It goes through because Portal, the chief of the air staff, is the ultimate boss, and he makes sure it goes through. So again, it's the only film that's there. It's a very good film because you've got actual Lancasters flying. The RAF are obviously flying them. The air-to-air photography is superb. The Derwent Dam, which was used for training up in the sort of Derbyshire area of England, and I think the film is extremely well done, and the effects are of their time, obviously. And bearing in mind that they couldn't show upkeep as a cylinder, it's shown as a ball because, again, it's still classified when they do this. But this is probably this film, and in particular the accompanying Dam Busters March, composed by Eric Coates. I can play it in my head anytime I want to think about it. It becomes iconic, and we will see when we talk about. At the end of this talk, we'll look at ways that music will come back again, and it was even used in the 2012 Olympics. So we will get onto that when we get to it. This is this book I did consult during my project. I didn't get as much as I wanted. It was out of print, and in the days before Kindle, Amazon, anything else, I had to go to the RAF Museum Library to actually get a look at it. So I only had a few hours on it, but it's probably the game-changing book about the story of Operation Chastise. This is the 82 edition. The next slide will show you the 2012 edition, which is still current and published. It's been added to slightly in this new edition, but it is able to look quite closely at the consequences of the Dams raid. So Sweetman's been in the archives. The 1943 papers would have been released in 1973-74, and so you've got some years of actual research being done as they analyse everything that goes on before the 82 version of the book can be published. But it looks at how substantial an effect was the breaching of the dam, and in all honesty, and it has been slightly addressed in the RAF official history too, not that effective. It's slightly dismissed, and even in a TV program, The World at War, it gets a small mention, and again saying it's sort of fairly ineffective in what it actually did. It caused destruction, there's no doubt about that, but it also has been argued by historians like James Holland that, you know, if you rebuild a dam, and these dams were rebuilt ready for the autumn rains, so fairly quickly, you have to take that resource and those assets from somewhere. So they were probably not on the Atlantic Wall in Normandy, increasing defences there, and were crucially back in Germany. It also caused the Germans to rethink about how they protect their dams. So it caused flak units and things like that to be deployed, balloons to be deployed. one or two of the dam buster veterans did wonder why they didn't go back, particularly when they had wooden scaffolding up the side and sort of bomb them. But I think once you played your one hand, then the air defence would have been too hot for, the casualty rate may have been even more troublesome than that. And we have to remember, when you go back to last lecture, we are talking some very intense flying at very low level for this. So it's still significant. This, I find, and having talked about how intense the flying is, I find this Channel 4 documentary series, which was released for the 2003, for the 60th anniversary of the raid, and the accompanying book, again with John Sweetman as the main technical historical advisor, is fascinating because they recreate the dam busters mission. So they interview the then current members of 617 Squadron, who are operating Tornado GR4s, and had probably seen experience in the Gulf War and that sort of thing, about what was needed. And they said, well, it's no point taking one of us who's been used to fighting a modern combat aircraft with all the electronic aids you have. You need to get a crew together who are trained but inexperienced. So for the film, the RAF allowed them to recruit 3 pilots and 5 air electronics operators, who then take on the different mission positions of one of the Lancasters on the raid. So you have a pilot and an air electronics operator who form the pilot and flight engineer. One of the pilots becomes a navigator, and they are trained on this specially built simulator. So it's got professional aeronautical engineers who worked on it, so they can create nighttime environment in the simulator. They can put the weather conditions in, they can change them. They create the replica of a Lancaster fuselage, so they put the people in the right positions, but they use it in a framework so the TV cameras can see everybody and can get their reactions. They take the crew off to the Canadian War Heritage Museum, and 4 of them fly inside the Canadian Lancaster. There are 2 flying Lancasters left in the world, the Canadian one and the RAF Battle of Britain Memorial Flight 1, which is currently grounded. So they give them all this experience, and then they give them training exercise. Let's fly the Lancaster, make sure the navigator can do all the manual calculations about wind drift and all the rest of it. But then they make them fly lower, and then you have you're 100 feet practicing it, and then finally they simulate the mission. And it's fascinating to look at them, because they are so absolutely wiped out by flying this actual mission as a simulator. And it's 100 feet there and back to Germany. It's about 60 feet over the water on the approach to the dam. So that's very intense flying. I found that's fascinating, because there's been nothing else I've read or seen which tries to give a modern thoughts about how difficult this was from a flying perspective. So I really I appreciated that. And the other great thing about it is there are 7 survivors at this point of the dams raid who were able to chip in and discuss what they'd seen and felt. And yeah, that's quite special, seeing those veterans as well. So I think this is also a great contribution to our understanding of the raid. I think on the next slide, yes, I mentioned James Holland earlier. So this takes us on to about 2012 now. So James is a very well-known, popular narrative historian. He runs the We Have Ways podcast, which I know quite a lot of Americans listen to. And he wrote this rather good book on the dams raid. It's not massively challenging. It's a good narrative story, but it does pick up on points, as I mentioned, about the diversion of effort to restoring, reconstructing the dams, and how that affects what happens on the D-Day beaches and the Atlantic Wall. So I found that particularly useful, and obviously he was able to make a TV program around it, and you can buy the audiobook and all the rest of it. So that's a more modern take on the Dambusters raid. The next slide shows a reappraisal. So now we're 2013 era. Alan Cooper is looking at, again, research that he's done in the past. He updates his research slightly to, he's the guy who identified the fact that Paul Brickhill confessed to making a bit up in the Dambusters book. It's again, we're now down at 2013. There are only 3 surviving veterans left of the campaign, of the raid. It was quite remarkable. I can remember the 2013 sunset service at RAF Scampton. The Battle of Britain Memorial Flight Lancaster landed. There was a 617 Squadron Tornado GR4, and the squadron was about to disband again, as it later reforms with the F-35B that we fly off our aircraft carriers. So the RAF have a mixed squadron of 617. It has got Navy pilots as well as Air Force pilots. But they had this symbolism of 1943 and 2013. And the 617, the modern squadron, makes every effort to associate itself with its history of the Dams raid. Right. As we saw, we know they used the lightning symbol even on the F-35, but obviously the squadron crest, which you can see in the middle of the book there, and Chris showed in his lecture last month, Après moi le déluge, and the dam being struck. So I found that that's another good read. The next one is a major piece of work. This is a very fine piece of scholarship by now Dr. Victoria Taylor, and I did speak to her before doing this talk, saying that I would definitely cite this particular work that she did. She beat me to the RAF Museum Prize when I also submitted my MA dissertation on First World War aviation. And she particularly readdresses the wartime and post-war mythologization of Operation Chastise. So some of the things I've mentioned, she's picked up in this book, and I will mention one or two other things which has helped me sort of formulate my thoughts towards tonight's presentation. But if you want to follow her, she's got a website called SpitfirePhillyAviation.com. She's Spitfire Philly on Twitter. And she's a very interesting historian. Her PhD's on the Luftwaffe and the Nazification side of things. So she looks at a different era, a different part of Second World War aviation for her actual PhD thesis. But that's probably the only piece of research that I've seen which looks at and analyzes why do we feel this way? Why don't we look at certain things? Why don't we? She addresses the things like the Mona catastrophe, which Dr. Chris Kalikowski referred to last time, but also the Blitzflut, so the actual flooding and how that went through the German villages and factories. And she speaks to certain veterans, and there are certain German historians who they quote. It's very interesting. For instance, she highlights the fact that the memorial at the Mona Dam is not just to those who lost their lives in the flood, but also to the aircrew. It's a terrible thing that happened to the people. But they also understand that the regime that they were suffering under, this was an operation against it rather than them, so to speak. So some excellent points that she's raised there. We look at the next slide. Much more a more recent publication than 2019-2020 is Max Hastings' Chastise. It's one that I've not thoroughly read, but I can tell you that it does again refer to the Mona catastrophe again. So it's looking at what cost it was to Germany and to the German people, as well as where the traditional focus is on to the British losses. And what we can definitely say is that, the British loss is 53 and 3 POWs out of a squadron of 19. It's of the aircraft that got through, it's 40% casualties. So this is significant. we remember that, and in Britain we tend to remember them rather than the German casualties, but it's important for the whole story, I think. The next slide, please. Right, this is a film which came out 2 or 3 years ago on the Lancaster bomber, but it's very interesting to note that the opening sequence of the film starts with the Battle of Britain Memorial's Lancaster flying over the lake at Derwent and then over the dam. On the whole recording, there's probably about 10 or 15 minutes talking to Johnny Johnson about this raid. Johnny Johnson, squadron leader George Leonard Johnson, who was a sergeant and on Joe McCarthy's crew, is the gentleman you see on the left of the picture. And he was the last surviving dam buster. So he died September 2022. And the other reason I like this picture is, and it was seen last time around as well, the third from right, sorry, is Joe McCarthy, the sole American on the raid and a Royal Canadian Air Force officer at the time. He stayed in the RCAF and actually was a wing commander, and then he retired to, I think he served in Virginia with operations there as well, and then retired to Virginia Beach. So that's a link with the US, and also that. And then this is almost to demonstrate, this is 2020, so 76 years after the raid. Dan Snow, a very popular British historian, presents these shows on the raid, and it's really to illustrate there are a lot of television shows which are made about this raid. There are modern historians. I think Victoria Taylor's interviewed on this particular one, and Max Hastings, talking about the mission and all the rest of it. But it's, again, it just goes to highlight how much this raid is involved itself in the British psyche. Other interesting things that came out of certainly Victoria Taylor's research, as I mentioned, if you think back to the London Olympics, there's an amazing scene where James Bond went meet the Queen, and then they take off in a helicopter to fly to the London Stadium, and then that's when you will hear the Dam Busters theme, and then the helicopter stops, and then the stunt people jump out, and then the Queen's there to open the Olympics. So it makes it to the Olympics in '89 and '90. I remember the adverts now, but again, thanks to Dr. Taylor reminding me, there were 2 lager beer commercials. I will name them because you can Google it. If you Google Carling Black Label and Dam Busters, you'll find the adverts. And one advert is set as the Lancasters coming in over the water. A German guard sees them, and then the whole thing becomes like a football match. So the guard winds up deflecting football-like bombs. They go the following year by having a British tourist with a towel, which is wrapped in a roll, a bit like a bouncing bomb, as a Union flag. And then Germans are about to mark their territory on the sunbed around a swimming pool. And then to the tune of the Dam Busters March, the towel is bounced along the swimming pool so that it opens up with the Union flag on it. They did attract some criticism for being a bit anti-German, and you could argue it trivializes the raid, but this goes to show you just how intensely that music, the whole concept of the bouncing bomb, has put itself in the British psyche. It's hard to tell. I mean, the fact that I can talk about this, the fact I've mentioned these books that I've read, or I've done the project when I was 16, shows you that's my general interest. I am an interested aviation historian, but if you ask people who know very little about the war, that music will probably resonate with them. It's, it got used by football crowds, sometimes some less wonderful football crowds of the 90s in certain European games against Germany, etc. So it's kind of really stuck there. Just to say that apart from that sort of thing, there have also been board games, computer games, an iPhone app, all sorts of things. So this has been really, I can't think of anything which has got quite such saturation in it. I have no doubt there will be more books, probably more television programs, and that sort of thing, because I don't think it's not going to go out. It's a good thing, and a great thing for, it does push accurately the story of precision bombing, which obviously the RAF today would like to think it specializes in. We have, we've had military operations in Iraq and ISIS, against ISIS and all these sort of things. So we're doing our role, as our other allied air forces as well. But yes, I think it sticks very much in the history. And I guess if this would be a point where you can ask me some questions if you have any.
Sure, I do. In the books that you've read, and as time has gone on, obviously the first book's written shortly after the war, and then very recently, and some of the classified documents have been released. How has that changed at all the perception of the raid, or is it just sort of maybe deepened the understanding of it, and also to some of the questions that come up about casualties and cost and effectiveness? Do you see that in your research?
I think I don't think it changes the popular narrative.
Right.
I don't think it changes the popular narrative historians and their role in it. I think it changes with academics when they're looking at it, because they'll drill down into this far more. But it's I don't know many people in the general public who buy academic books on this sort of subject, because they can be quite dry, and if you're looking at orders and things like that, then it's not really it's not going to be a bestseller. So yes and no is the answer. I think it has in the academic world, where they've studied that, they looked at German historians and what they've said, but inside the popular narrative, no. I don't think it's really going to change anything. It's very fixed. We have certain fixed things in our mind. So people have talked about the Blitz spirit. Mm-hmm. We had that during the COVID situation. People said, well, we've got to be like the Blitz spirit and do this, or we didn't cower away in the Blitz, but yeah, that was bombs and this is a virus. But but people still talk about that kind of thing. So this is embedded in there with it. You've got the Battle of Britain, so we see an image of the Battle of Britain, and politicians will say we were alone when we weren't. During the Battle of Britain, we had the entire empire with us as well, mm-hmm. And that was significant. So we weren't, but in popular and populist imagery, then I don't think anything changes, and I don't think this raid will either.
Has all the research that's come out, has it changed your perception of it? And if so, how?
I think when I wrote my project, I had seen John Sweetman's stuff, so I thought, hello, this is a bit challenging, and Mickey Martin didn't like it. I think he uses the word scoundrel to refer to Dr. Sweetman, if I remember correctly. So and of course they're in a path. You have this thing, in particularly, it was very controversial, Arthur Harris's statue being unveiled in '92, I think. And it is not just to him; it's to the 50,000 odd bomber command who fell. But there was an awful backlash against it, and people are opposed to him. His statue is right outside the RAF church at St Clement Danes in London, and Air Chief Marshal Dowding's statue had been there for some years before. So you've got the Chief of Fighter Command during the Battle of Britain. So you put up the head of Bomber Command throughout a lot of the war and the latter part of the war, and you have this reaction to it, which is some may find very strange. I think it was because there was this revolt, and 3 years later in 1995 you have the 50th anniversary of Dresden, and there is this thing about Dresden, and the city of Coventry in the Midlands of England are linked. They were twinned even when Dresden was in the East Germany, because Coventry was very, very badly bombed during the Blitz, and Coventry Cathedral was pretty much destroyed. They left the wreckage of the walls, etc., alone as a memorial to the bombing at Coventry, and then they rebuilt a new cathedral next to it. So I've seen services at Coventry and Dresden about this huge bombing campaign, and I think it's certainly it provoked quite a debate with the RAF veterans, who, again, the veterans have been doing their job and what they've told to do in the area bombing campaign. And again, you can go back to what, and I agree with James Holland, this could have stopped at any point. But Dresden is particularly controversial in British history, I'd say, and that has driven certain things. But it's helped. The Dam Buster story comes out of this again because the RAF were very keen post-war to make sure this is an example of precision bombing and what we can do. So it's against some negativity. It's a very positive thing.
If no operation in this war, actually any war, it comes off 100% positive. There's always a negative side to it, and it can be debated back and forth. But you did mention early on about politics sort of playing a role in, I guess, the what you would call the not a denigration of Bomber Command, but sort of them having to go on the defensive as Churchill sort of backed away from the Dresden raid and kind of left them standing alone, right? And it kind of changed the public perspective on the Bomber Command, and that affects a lot of things going forward, including the fact that there was no memorial to Bomber Command until the 90s.
Or even later than that. I think it's 2012 they opened the official memorial.
2012. Okay. So
it's a wonderful memorial. I urge people to Google the Bomber Command Memorial, and you'll see a picture of it. It's got a crew, and they've carefully made it so you can't see any ranks on the statues of the crew. But they're coming back, so they're holding a flying helmet and this sort of thing, and that's the centerpiece. And then there are names in the middle of it. It's in Portland stone. It's really quite an amazing structure. But the fact it was, I remember watching it on television when it was opened. So the Lancaster flew past and dropped poppy wreaths and this sort of thing, and it was opened by the Queen. But the question is, why was it so late? That's the question that a lot of veterans, feel quite betrayed about. I think it was one of the Bee Gees, Robbie Gibb, actually, was really, really instrumental in getting the campaign for the funding of this memorial going. So although the RAF, it could look to other roles, the fighter command role and all the rest of it. So it's just the Bomber Command veterans, so I think, were left hanging a bit, really, which is very sad, because I think you have to, as my father always said, there's a quote, I think, of Churchill, "He who sows the wind reaps the whirlwind." And for a long time, Bomber Command were the people going out to deliver the war to Germany. We have the North African campaign, which successfully finishes in May 1943, but that's not in Europe, that's North Africa. You've got the Battle of the Atlantic going on for the entire war, which has its ups and downs, but that's another battle, but that's seen as vital. That's Britain's interests and survival, having the trade with the USA, and there's no negative connotation on that. The U-boats are very clearly the bad guys. So it kind of leaves Bomber Command in this awkward position.
Throughout your research, you mentioned that even folks with a casual understanding of World War II know the Dam Buster raid. Is that would that and Battle of Britain be the two things that would stand out the most to the general public, especially the younger generations?
Quite probably, yes, because the Battle of Britain movie is again, it's an iconic movie. Everyone can. Much longer film score with different parts like the Luftwaffe March, but it will be played by the Central Band of the Royal Air Force like the Dam Busters March. Some people think that 633 Squadron is a real RAF squadron. That's the power of a movie.
Yeah.
The RAF have to point out on their website, if you want to research a squadron, please don't ask for 633. It didn't exist. It's so people see what they think. It's the power of the movie, I think, which can do things. And I also think modern television can do that. I've seen Masters of the Air, for instance, and I've read Don Miller's book. And I think it's a tremendous piece of television. It's brilliantly written by John Orloff, and it shows what it was like for the 8th Air Force flying out of Thorpe Abbots. And I I don't criticize anything about it. I think the CGI was perfect. I think they got it really well done. And it's something like that can be very powerful in education as well, because a lot of, some of today's youth may watch that, but they're not going to read Don Miller's book. And I think, although we had to make these films in the 50s when we had the money to kind of make big Hollywood type movies, I think that's what the Dam Busters and the Battle of Britain films do. I'm trying to think of any other major. There are other World War II films featuring Britain, things like Ice Cold and Alex and whatnot, but again, they're fictional. Mm-hmm. So of actual things, probably they're the two most iconic, because I don't think some of the other movies are quite, there's the Bridge at Remagen, there's the absolutely dreadful Battle of the Bulge film. I'm just expressing a couple of opinions here, but I mean, I'm not Joe Public, unfortunately, because I studied military history, and I know I'm a First World War guy, but there's even fewer films about the First World War. But a Second World War film, it's very much it's dominated by what was made in the 50s and 60s, and more recent stuff. I mean, obviously Band of Brothers and the Pacific, as well as Masters of the Air for what I look at as great US television of the war. But no, I really can't think. Probably something will pop into my head after the show's over, but no, I can't really think of anything else.
All right. Before we close out tonight, I do want to point out that you are a member of the UK wing of the Commemorative Air Force. Congratulations on you and your fellow members putting that together. You've been organized now a couple of years, 3-4 years?
Probably 2 or 3 years. Yeah, definitely. Probably would be a 4th year coming up next year, I think.
All right. And what are some of the activities that you're involved with? Yeah.
We go to air shows from time to time with a tent, or Second World War show like the We Have Ways Festival, which is related to the podcast I mentioned earlier. So we do that. We try and encourage new members. Here's my joke. In the ETO, you have all the aircraft, but we have all the airfields. So it's people who go to the States. I mean, when I was, I used to go to the States, I don't know, 4 times a year when I was running a UK subsidiary of an American company. And I thought I did join the CAF earlier then, because I thought I might be there at a time for an air show or something like that, and never quite worked out. And then since I've moved on to do other things, I sort of rejoined because I'm interested in still. If I get the chance to go back to the States, I'll make sure I time it for the right air show or something, like Wings Over Dallas or something like that. Because I'm very interested in American as well as British military history, particularly aviation history. And I think also things like Masters of the Air and the interest of certain airfields and some of the history fascinate me still. So we do that. We've organised trips. We've been to the Cold War Museum at RAF Bentwaters. As I said, volunteering at Greenham Common. I've got a very strong affiliation with that sort of brother and the Central Texas wing, therefore. I'm trying to think. Some of my colleagues will be at an air show coming up at Seaboalt very shortly. I'm leading a guided walk around Greenham, so I can't actually be there. But it's that kind of thing. It's small stuff. We like to try and get to some air shows. I was at the RAF Abingdon Air Show a couple of years ago, and the CAF UK put up a stand there. So we fly the flag for US historical aviation, and we do have a couple of great museums in the UK. So at the Imperial War Museum, Duxford, there's the whole American hangar museum there. So it's got a B-52. In fact, I was at a dinner, a black tie dinner once, and we had it under the wing of the B-52 at Duxford. It had been organised. It was a dental conference, but it had been organised by a couple of ex-RAF dentists who so we had a Spitfire display, and then we had dinner, and then the Glenn Miller band came in to do some music. So we had, we still very much we commemorate both. Well, I certainly do, both British and US military aviation, and I think it shows the huge sacrifices of Bomber Command and the equally large sacrifices of the 8th Air Force are always worth commemorating and remembering. And I think, as we showed with the big D-Day 80, that the service at the memorial stones outside the tower at Greenham Commons show that we have this this huge war where so many of our young men gave their lives, and young women too.
Any final thoughts before we wrap up this evening?
I think it's just fascinating to look at how one raid, and you mentioned the Doolittle raid in American aviation history. This is very much the same. This raid is unique. It's the most celebrated raid the RAF have ever done in its history, I think, which is shown by the amount of, and I've only shown you some of the literature that I'm aware of. There is other stuff too, the iconic film, the television programs, the research into it. I think it occupies a very special place in the British psyche, and I can't see it changing anytime soon.
All right. Well, thank you for joining us this evening, and thanks to you at home for watching. We'd love to hear your thoughts on tonight's episode or any ideas you might have for a future topic. Please feel free to drop us a line at media@cafhq.org. Remember, if you like tonight's show, please share it across your social media platforms, and remember to subscribe and click the bell icon to get notifications when new episodes of Warbird Tube are posted. Until next time, I'm Steve Bose, wishing you blue skies and tailwinds. Have a great night.
Thank you.